Right now, gold sits behind glass and jewelry stores, gets traded on global markets, and functions as one of the most universally recognized symbols of wealth on the entire planet. It's easy to assume this status is somehow inherent to the metal itself, as though gold was always destined to become humanity's favorite precious substance. But gold's actual history starts a lot more simply than that, with early humans stumbling across a strange, heavy, oddly colored rock that didn't behave like anything else they'd previously encountered. So when did humans actually first find gold? And what made this particular metal so immediately and consistently captivating across so many completely unconnected ancient cultures? Let's dig into this properly, because the answer involves some remarkably interesting material science, a surprisingly early timeline, and a pattern of independent human fascination that shows up again and again across completely separate ancient civilizations. Let's start with the most basic question worth addressing first. How would early humans have actually encountered gold in the first place, given that it wasn't something anyone was deliberately mining or searching for initially? The answer lies in gold's specific physical properties and how it naturally occurs in the environment. Unlike most metals, which typically exist bound up within ore, requiring smelting and considerable metallurgical processing to extract usable metal, gold frequently occurs in nature in its pure, metallic form, sometimes as small nuggets or flakes that can be found directly in riverbeds and streams, washed down and naturally concentrated through the same erosion processes that shape river systems more broadly. This means early humans didn't need any smelting technology or metallurgical knowledge whatsoever to encounter and collect usable gold. They simply needed to notice it lying visibly on the ground or in a riverbed, already in a form that required no further processing to recognize as something distinctly unusual and interesting. This detail is seriously important for understanding why gold likely entered human awareness so much earlier than most other metals specifically. Copper, one of the other earliest metals humans began working with, also occasionally occurs in a naturally pure, usable form, but considerably less commonly and less accessibly compared to gold's relatively frequent natural occurrence in stream and riverbed deposits across a wide range of different geological regions. This natural accessibility gave gold a significant practical head start over most other metals in terms of when humans could plausibly have first encountered and started using it, well before the development of any dedicated mining or smelting technology. Let's talk about the archaeological evidence for the earliest human gold use, because researchers have found compelling evidence pushing this timeline back considerably further than casual popular assumptions about ancient gold use might otherwise suggest. Some of the earliest confirmed archaeological evidence of worked gold objects comes from sites in Eastern Europe, specifically Bulgaria, dating to roughly 6,000 years ago, showing sophisticated gold jewelry and decorative items that already display considerable skill and technical refinement, strongly suggesting gold working itself likely began somewhat earlier still, since this level of craftsmanship implies an already meaningfully established, practiced tradition rather than representing the very first tentative experiments with an entirely unfamiliar material. This detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means humans were already creating sophisticated, technically accomplished gold jewelry thousands of years before some of the more commonly discussed ancient civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and others frequently associated with early gold use in popular historical discussion, had even fully developed as organized, centralized societies in the specific forms most people typically picture. Gold working, in other words, likely represents one of humanity's truly earliest sophisticated metalworking traditions, predating considerably more famous later golden ages of ancient goldsmithing by a meaningful stretch of additional history. Let's talk about why gold specifically captivated early humans so consistently and so immediately, because this represents a seriously interesting question worth exploring in some real depth. Gold possesses several distinctive physical properties that would have made it immediately visibly different from virtually anything else early humans regularly encountered in their environment. Its distinctive, warm yellow color stands out dramatically against the natural browns, grays, and greens that dominate most typical environments. Its unusual weight and density would have felt immediately different and notable when picked up and handled directly. And critically, unlike many other metals, gold doesn't tarnish, corrode, or lose its distinctive shine over time, meaning a piece of worked gold retains its original, striking appearance indefinitely, rather than gradually dulling or discoloring the way many other materials, including several other early metals, typically do with extended exposure to air and moisture. This particular combination of properties, distinctive color, unusual weight, and remarkable, essentially permanent resistance to tarnishing and corrosion, likely explains a great deal about why gold specifically captured early human attention and fascination so consistently across so many completely separate, unconnected ancient cultures and regions, each of which had no possible contact or communication with the others regarding this specific material. This represents another compelling example of the broader pattern already explored extensively throughout other topics regarding independent human convergence, different populations facing the same basic underlying material properties, independently arriving at strikingly similar conclusions about that material's significance and value, without requiring any shared cultural contact or transmission between these completely separate groups. Let's talk about gold's remarkable workability too, because this represents another critical practical property worth exploring specifically. Gold is exceptionally malleable and ductile, meaning it can be hammered into extremely thin sheets or drawn into fine wire without cracking or breaking, using nothing more than simple, direct hammering with basic stone tools well before any sophisticated metalworking technology had been developed. This remarkable workability meant early humans could shape gold into decorative items relatively easily without requiring the more advanced smelting and casting technology eventually needed to work with harder, more structurally useful metals like bronze or iron. Gold, in this specific sense, likely represented one of the most immediately accessible metals for early decorative and symbolic use, precisely because its natural softness made it workable using only the most basic tool technology already available to early humans, well before more demanding metallurgical techniques had been developed for other, harder metals. Let's talk about how researchers actually confirm and date these very early gold artifacts, because this represents an interesting methodological question worth addressing directly, given that gold itself, unlike organic materials discussed extensively in other topics, doesn't decay or provide the same kind of direct chemical dating opportunities. Since gold itself doesn't contain the organic material needed for radiocarbon dating specifically, researchers typically rely on dating the surrounding archaeological context, organic material found alongside the gold objects in the same burial or settlement layer, or associated artifacts made from materials that can be more directly dated to establish a reasonably confident timeline for when specific gold objects were actually created and used. This indirect dating approach means the confirmed timeline for early gold use, while reasonably solid for well-documented sites like the Bulgarian discoveries already mentioned, still carries some inherent uncertainty, and researchers generally remain appropriately open to this established timeline shifting further back should additional, well-documented archaeological sites eventually be discovered and properly dated using these same careful, indirect methods. Let's talk about gold in ancient Chinese civilization too, because this represents another significant, independently developing ancient gold-working tradition worth exploring specifically. While gold held somewhat less central religious and symbolic significance in ancient China compared to its role in ancient Egypt specifically, Chinese craftsmen developed sophisticated gold-working techniques from a relatively early period. Though jade actually held considerably greater cultural and symbolic prestige within traditional Chinese culture during much of its ancient history, representing an interesting comparative example worth mentioning specifically. This detail is worth including because it demonstrates that gold's eventual near-universal status as humanity's preeminent precious material wasn't actually inevitable or automatic in every single ancient culture. Some ancient civilizations, China included, developed alternative material hierarchies where other substances, jade specifically in the Chinese case, held comparable or even superior cultural prestige and symbolic significance compared to gold, at least during certain specific historical periods, before gold's value eventually became more globally standardized through extensive later trade and cultural exchange across different regions and civilizations. Let's talk about ancient Australian Aboriginal relationships with gold too, because this offers an interesting, less commonly discussed comparative example worth mentioning specifically. Despite gold being naturally present within the Australian continent, and despite Aboriginal Australian cultures possessing extraordinarily long, sophisticated, continuous cultural traditions stretching back tens of thousands of years. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Extensive gold working similar to what developed in Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas didn't become a major, widespread cultural or economic feature within most traditional Aboriginal Australian societies prior to European contact specifically. This detail is seriously worth including because it provides an important, useful counterexample to the broader pattern of independent gold fascination already discussed extensively throughout this topic, demonstrating that gold's distinctive physical properties alone, while clearly compelling and immediately noticeable to humans across an enormous range of different cultures, didn't automatically or inevitably guarantee the same specific cultural response. Extensive decorative working and elevated symbolic status in absolutely every single human culture that happened to have physical access to natural gold deposits, suggesting cultural values, available technology, and specific historical circumstances still played a meaningful, sometimes decisive role in shaping exactly how and whether any given culture ultimately developed extensive gold-working traditions. Let's talk about alchemy briefly too, because gold's unique, essentially unchanging physical properties eventually inspired an entire elaborate later tradition of philosophical and pseudoscientific inquiry worth mentioning specifically. Even though it falls considerably later chronologically than the core early discovery period this topic primarily focuses on. Alchemists across various later ancient and medieval cultures became deeply fascinated specifically with gold's remarkable resistance to tarnishing, decay, and corrosion. Viewing this distinctive permanence as representing a kind of physical perfection worth understanding, replicating, and notoriously attempting to artificially produce through various chemical and philosophical experimentation, including the famous, ultimately unsuccessful, historical quest to transform more common metals directly into gold through various alchemical processes. While alchemy itself ultimately failed at its most famous specific goal, the sustained, centuries-long fascination with understanding gold's unique properties that alchemical practice reflected demonstrates just how deeply and persistently this particular metal's distinctive characteristics captured sustained human intellectual attention and curiosity, extending well beyond purely decorative or economic interest alone into genuine philosophical and early scientific inquiry. Let's talk about gold's connection to sun worship and solar religious symbolism too, because this represents a particularly striking recurring pattern worth exploring specifically, given how consistently it shows up across so many completely separate ancient cultures already discussed throughout this topic. Beyond ancient Egypt's specific solar associations already mentioned, various completely unconnected ancient civilizations, including several in the Americas already discussed, independently developed strong symbolic connections between gold and the sun, likely reflecting gold's distinctive, warm yellow color bearing an obvious, immediately noticeable visual resemblance to sunlight itself. This particular symbolic pattern, connecting gold specifically to solar imagery and religious significance, represents yet another compelling example of independent convergent cultural development, different, completely separate ancient civilizations arriving at strikingly similar symbolic conclusions about the same physical material, based on the same basic, universally observable visual association between gold's color and the appearance of the sun itself, entirely independent of any possible shared cultural contact or transmission between these separate societies. Let's talk about ancient Egypt specifically now, because it represents one of the most extensively documented and most historically significant ancient gold working traditions worth exploring in some detail. Egyptian civilization developed an extraordinarily sophisticated relationship with gold, closely tied to religious and spiritual significance. With gold specifically associated with the sun god, and considered symbolically connected to the flesh of the gods themselves within Egyptian religious belief. This religious and symbolic significance drove enormous demand for gold within Egyptian society, particularly for royal burial items, religious objects, and elaborate jewelry intended for both the living elite and, notably, for burial alongside deceased pharaohs and other high-status individuals, based on the belief that gold's permanence and resistance to decay made it particularly appropriate for accompanying the dead into whatever afterlife Egyptian religious belief anticipated. Egyptian gold mining operations, extensively documented through both archaeological remains and surviving historical records, represented a significant, organized economic and logistical undertaking, involving considerable state-organized labor specifically directed toward locating, extracting, and processing gold from various mining sites, primarily located in the eastern desert regions and in Nubia to the south. The sheer scale of ancient Egyptian gold production and use, reflected dramatically in famous archaeological discoveries like the treasures found within Tutankhamun's tomb, demonstrates just how thoroughly gold had become integrated into the religious, political, and economic fabric of ancient Egyptian civilization specifically, well beyond simple decorative or purely economic function alone. Let's talk about ancient Mesopotamia and other early Near Eastern civilizations too, because gold working developed there independently, roughly overlapping chronologically with early Egyptian gold use, though reflecting its own distinct cultural and religious significance rather than simply representing direct cultural transmission or copying from Egypt specifically. Sumerian and later Mesopotamian gold work, evidenced through remarkable archaeological discoveries including elaborate royal burial goods, demonstrates sophisticated gold-working techniques developing independently within this specific region, further reinforcing the broader pattern already discussed regarding gold's independent, repeated discovery and cultural elevation across multiple separate ancient civilizations, rather than representing a single point of origin that then spread outward to every other ancient culture that eventually came to value gold highly. Let's talk about the Americas too, because gold working developed there completely independently from any Old World influence whatsoever, given the complete absence of any transoceanic contact between these regions during the relevant historical periods. Various ancient civilizations throughout Central and South America, including cultures that eventually influenced or preceded the more widely known Aztec and Inca civilizations, developed sophisticated gold-working traditions entirely independently, with archaeological evidence suggesting gold working in parts of South America specifically may have begun remarkably early, in some cases potentially predating or roughly coinciding with some of the earliest confirmed Old World gold working evidence already discussed regarding Eastern Europe specifically. This completely independent development of sophisticated gold-working traditions in the Americas, entirely disconnected from any Old World cultural influence or transmission whatsoever, represents perhaps the single most compelling piece of evidence supporting the broader argument already made throughout this topic. Gold's appeal to early humans reflects something closer to a truly independent, repeatedly convergent human response, rather than primarily a matter of cultural transmission or shared learning between connected societies, to gold's own distinctive physical properties, color, weight, workability, and permanence, arising separately and repeatedly wherever humans happened to encounter this particular material, regardless of any possible cultural contact or connection between these completely separate groups. Let's talk about gold's transition from purely decorative and religious significance toward functioning as a form of currency and standardized economic value too, because this represents an important, somewhat later chapter in this broader story worth addressing specifically. While early gold use was overwhelmingly decorative, religious, and symbolic in nature, gold's specific properties, durability, divisibility, and widely recognized value across many different cultures and regions eventually made it a natural candidate for use as a standardized medium of economic exchange, a role that developed gradually across various ancient civilizations before eventually becoming formalized into actual minted gold coinage, which historians generally trace to ancient Lydia in what's now Western Turkey, roughly 26 centuries ago, representing one of the earliest well-documented instances of standardized metal currency more broadly, not just gold specifically. Let's talk about gold's role in early long-distance trade networks too, because this represents another significant, historically consequential dimension of this broader story worth addressing directly. Gold's combination of high value relative to its weight, durability, and near-universal recognition of its worth across many different cultures made it an unusually practical material for long-distance trade, considerably easier to transport securely across long distances compared to bulkier trade goods carrying comparable overall economic value. Archaeological evidence of gold objects found considerable distances from their most likely original source region provides valuable evidence of extensive ancient trade networks. Since a gold object discovered far from any known local gold deposit strongly suggests that object, or at minimum the raw material used to create it, traveled a significant distance through some kind of organized trade or exchange network before reaching its final resting place. This kind of evidence has proven valuable for researchers reconstructing the scope and reach of various ancient trade networks more broadly, since gold's durability and distinctiveness make it a particularly useful, traceable marker for this kind of broader archaeological and historical reconstruction work. Let's talk briefly about gold's continued symbolic power into more recent history too, because it's worth appreciating just how remarkably consistent gold's elevated cultural status has remained across an enormous span of subsequent human history, right through to the present day. Despite dramatic changes in political systems, religious beliefs, economic structures, and available technology across the many thousands of years separating those earliest Bulgarian gold artifacts from modern gold jewelry and modern gold markets, gold's fundamental cultural and economic status as an exceptionally valuable, desirable material has remained remarkably stable and consistent throughout this entire span of human history. Few other cultural values or material preferences have proven anywhere near this durable and consistent across such an enormous stretch of dramatically changing human history, which itself represents a truly remarkable testament to just how deeply and consistently gold's distinctive physical properties have continued resonating with human aesthetic and economic sensibilities across cultures, across centuries, and across almost every dramatic shift in human society, technology, and belief that has occurred since those very first ancient humans originally noticed a strange, heavy, oddly colored rock glinting in an ancient riverbed. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full story of when humans first found gold turns out to be considerably older and considerably more independently repeated across completely separate ancient civilizations than a simple, single point of discovery could ever fully capture. Early humans likely first encountered gold considerably earlier than the confirmed 6,000-year-old archaeological evidence from Eastern Europe might suggest, given that this evidence already shows sophisticated technical skill implying an even earlier, less well-documented period of initial discovery and experimentation. Gold's own distinctive physical properties, its striking color, its unusual weight, its remarkable workability, and its essentially permanent resistance to tarnishing and decay, meant that once humans anywhere in the world encountered this particular material, a strikingly similar pattern of fascination, decorative use, and eventually deep religious and economic significance tended to develop independently, repeatedly, across an enormous range of completely separate, unconnected ancient civilizations spanning multiple continents entirely disconnected from each other. So the next time you see a piece of gold jewelry, it's worth remembering that you're looking at a material that captured human imagination independently over and over again across completely separate branches of human civilization that had no possible knowledge of or contact with each other, each one arriving at a strikingly similar conclusion about this particular yellow metal's exceptional value and significance, purely through their own direct, independent encounter with gold's own distinctive, immediately noticeable physical properties. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as culturally significant as gold's enduring value and appeal arose this independently and this repeatedly across completely disconnected ancient civilizations around the entire world, What does that suggest about how much of what we consider deeply cultural, deeply symbolic human value might actually be rooted in something closer to a shared, universal human response to certain distinctive physical properties themselves, rather than purely representing an arbitrary, culturally specific tradition that just happened to spread and take hold in different places for entirely unrelated reasons?